Dune Spice Wars released to relatively positive reviews across the board. However, drawing from some of the most popular Steam reviews, you can see criticism of this early access release for Dune Spice Wars, the complex blend between real-time strategy 4X and potentially much more, which is what I'll discuss in this video, alongside what I've identified as the 5 key criticisms taken from those reviews, from other publishers, and from conversations I've had on forums and crucially during live streams. I've live streamed Dune, I've made videos on Spice Wars, and I like the strategy game that is Dune Spice Wars. However, I also think it's important to dig into why people hate Dune Spice Wars. Why do people dislike this game? What are the common criticisms? Could they affect your buying decisions? Do you agree or disagree with them? I think these discussions are interesting and healthy to have. So, disclaimers aside, once we've smashed the like button to get all of the spice under our control, let's begin. First and foremost, complications and complexity. This is a bit of a strange one because it's sort of arguing for one thing and then arguing for the opposite, but the argument is essentially as follows. This game is sort of like Stellaris, but on one planet. Too many resources to manage. It's overly complicated. There are too many complications in the way of the game, is the argument. The second part, complexity. The first reviewer on Steam goes on to say, after talking about the complications, unnecessary complications of the game, that Dune Spice Wars is overly complex in other areas. Espionage, for example, is large but needs a very detailed tutorial to get to know what you're doing. A video, actually, that I'm thinking about making, but that's a shameless plug that I didn't need to put here. Their points are actually fairly well taken, and I think as we go through this whole video, it's important to remember that this is indeed an early access release, and dare I say, a proper one. But I don't want to get too controversial, because we're already discussing topics that are sentiment and belief-based sometimes, and can carry with them controversy. I would like to also unpack the second point, aside from the complications factor, which personally I don't find the game to be too overcomplicated in terms of the resource yields. I think in the market that it's applying for, the 4X, the strategy, the real-time strategy, I think it fits perfectly fine with that genre, personally. On the second point, though, around the complex systems, yeah, I get that. Espionage is a little difficult, and it does take a minute to realize, oh, right, so I can actually win by... And these things up here are actually jobs that I can elect myself into, like Speaker of the House, that's a thing. So I get that. Again, I suspect this is an element of early access rather than the full experience, but only time will tell here, so I can't go any further than that. The second criticism I've identified is around where Dune Spice Wars stands. Is Dune Spice Wars a 4X game? Many people think it's not. The first reviewer of the most popular negative review goes on to say that I gave a negative review because this game got much more resource management than needed as a 4X game, and game always slows you down crazy with upkeeps at everything. Now, English is not everybody's strong suit, that's fine. The more important point that should be taken from here, and I don't want the English to distract from it, is that this is not a 4X game. There's too much... This person argues resource management. I think that's a key part. Well, it's really one of the X's in 4X, is sort of devoted to resources in a way. So I'm not quite sure about that, but I think the overall framing is somewhat justified. This is a complicated beast. Dune Spice Wars doesn't really quite fit perfectly into any box. It is a real-time strategy. The game plays out in real time. You can pause it, adjust the speed like you can in, say, Stellaris, for example. Relatively good, but not perfect comparison to this game. My goodness, you spend about 10 times as long in a game of Stellaris than you will in a game of Dune Spice Wars, just to scratch the surface there. But it's an important comparison. You have these real-time elements. Age of Empires, Total War, Bannerlord, I could go on. You also have some strong 4X elements as well, though, although they're perhaps less obvious up front, and maybe also somewhat hidden from the fact that this game clearly takes some lead and some inspiration from Shiro Games, who literally made it, and their previous game Northgard, which, if you haven't played it, is sort of a somewhat hardcore or at least dedicated survival territory / city management game. It looks similar to Dune Spice Wars when you zoom out and look at the map. The territory system, very similar. Survival elements similar, although very different. But you've got a giant worm, you've got bears, you could kind of trade them out. Essentially what I'm saying here is that Dune Spice Wars is not a 4X game. When I think 4X game, I think Civ, frankly. And I think a lot of people are the same. Of course, when I delve into it more, I think of loads more. But Civ is that sort of go-to, that 4X Civ, which also carries other subgenres like historical strategy with it that don't quite fit. In fact, they don't fit at all with the Dune Spice Wars narrative. So it's a little bit tricky to just say this is a 4X game because it's not. It's playing out in real time. A lot of people will consider the traditional 4X to be turn-based. There's another really obvious example that will slap you across the face. I think Dune Spice Wars is actually an interesting blend between real-time strategy, 4X strategy, and then a couple of other elements. I think it's got a huge survival element to it. There is sort of a hardcore need to survive. This is a desert planet after all. It's like I've dropped you onto Mars, and Elon hasn't nuked the poles just yet. So you're shite out of luck. This is a tough environment. Survival is key in this game, just as the real-time strategy element and just other layered 4X elements from scouting in the early game through to deep layered espionage in the late game. It even has a little pinch of that kind of StarCrafty sort of MOBA element with the operations that you trigger on the territories, the smugglers with their infiltration, laying their traps, you move in, it weakens their defenses. It's a wonderful blend, and I think it might be best to literally just call it a strategy game and just leave it at that. Because I think that some of the criticism, the misunderstandings, some criticism rightly so, some criticism perhaps not so much, comes down to this framing and this understanding. And if we take a step back, it might be a little easier to see what we're looking at. Next up, and this one is a big one, it leads on a little bit from the house management point, but more importantly, it's about old Dune. Or where does this game sit within the lore? The first sort of point to the argument I've already addressed here. This reviewer, which has been echoed in other places and in our discussions in the live streams, believes the game isn't really properly in the right place. Too much house management, too much Game of Thrones, not enough combat, not enough military combat specifically like old Dune games. And you know, they've probably got a point. Now, was I old enough to play those games? Well, I was around and I could have played them, but I didn't. Probably, you might say, too young. So I can't really comment on that. I don't share that sentiment, I don't share that emotion, I don't share that nostalgia, belief, or attachment, so I'll put that to one side. The other more interesting point here is about how it relates to old Dune, and also the role of combat. Let's unpack both of those. The role of combat is an easier one to address. Combat is important in this game, but not the only pillar. The political pillar is just as important, and the operations, sort of agents, espionage, supply, tactics, that's your other really important one as well. You could also argue, of course, there's a massive economic pillar here too. It doesn't have a direct victory condition, but it might as well. The spice is involved, money is involved, it's massive. So no, this is a much more balanced strategy game. Military combat is important, but not the be-all, end-all here by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's on level playing with every other element. Personally, I actually quite enjoy that. Moving along to the second part, though, this sort of old Dune, and how is this world reflected? Again, this is something I'm not overly emotionally attached to, and maybe that's why I struggle to relate to these arguments, because I can't fully. However, I absolutely understand that friction between there being a franchise that exists in film and a franchise that exists in book, and maybe, depending on the franchise and place and time and whatever it might be, there could be multiple universes within books or what have you. It's a fragmented story told in different ways, houses displayed in different colors, for example. That's a very obvious one that comes up. Why are they green? They should be blue. This kind of thing. And that reflects through so strongly that it features in negative reviews on the front page of Steam. Now, you might say, negative reviews on the front page for this game on Steam are nothing to go by. And you could be right. However, they've made it to the front page. There's a lot of support behind this. So let's try and understand it a little better. I think here, fundamentally, it is again a misframing of the game, perhaps, that could help fuel a better understanding of what this is based around. It's also probably a case of recency where the game is based more around my understanding, more around the books, whereas perhaps recent modern players are more akin to think of the recent film. I'm not sure. I don't know how to unpack that one. I don't feel strongly about it, but I wanted to highlight it because it does matter to some people, to quite a few people, actually. Around 20%, perhaps? Up to 30% if the ratio of negative reviews and support on these reviews is anything to go by. This includes reviews from publishers as well. So it does matter to a good chunk of you out there, and I think that's important to address. Next up, this one is a really interesting one as well, actually. It tickles me a lot. Dune is not good if you're not a fan of Dune. So, this builds on what we've already discussed, but actually in a much more specific way, because now we're talking about the game itself. Can you play Dune Spice Wars if you've not read Dune? If you've not watched Dune? This reviewer argues no. Again, a very popular review on Steam. It's like the 5th most popular. 271 found it helpful. 19 found it funny. Take that what you will. But either way, this is an incredibly popular review from a seasoned reviewer. They say, I wouldn't really recommend this game if you're not a fan of Dune. Many people recommending seem, in my regard, kind of biased due to their love of the series. Just look at the reviews full of Dune references and little about the game itself. And there's a point here. I personally disagree with it, but there is a point to be made. Absolutely, this game is framed around Dune. It slaps you in the face as soon as you load it up. Dune Spice Wars, right? You can't really get past that. So there's always going to be a flavor element. This reviewer argues that the flavor element is so strong that it prohibits the experience. That's theirs. Others have shared it. You might feel that way too. So take care when you're watching your reviews or whatever, because there is some controversy and some hate on Dune here because of this misrepresentation. So do bear that in mind. Don't feel that they quite relate to it. For what it's worth, I went in the same. I've only just watched the most recent Dune film, and that is all of my exposure at all, ever. No games, no books, no prior films, no nothing. And I went in actually playing this game before I'd watched the film as well. Playing the game made me want to watch the film because I was interested in finding out more, not because I felt like I had to. Dune Spice Wars stands alone as an enjoyable strategy game and sits in a sci-fi setting, in the same way that other strategy games sit in other settings. A medieval city builder, for example. I don't feel the need, personally, to know a lot about how medieval cities were built to enjoy a medieval city builder. And I think that Dune can be easily enjoyed without being fully involved in the lore. Yes, the factions and houses carry a lot of lore with them, but that translates through into game mechanics that are simple one-sentence lines, often paper, scissors, rock interactions that we're used to in strategy games. So I personally disagree, but there is some sentiment behind it. Last but not least, here, I want to talk about perhaps the most important point of all, that it's too light of a game. That Dune Spice Wars, as it is, doesn't have the legs, the sticking power. I talked about this a little bit in yesterday's video, my kind of deep dive, frequently asked questions about Dune. And I'd like to reiterate that point and build on it a bit more, but first and foremost, let's look at the point that's being made. It's too light of a game. Reviewers from many different places argue that it lacks complexity in its military and battle. We've talked about this a little bit already, so I will put that one to one side, but it is fair enough. If you're looking for grand military battles, this is not the game for you. Yet, anyway. I can't say how it would develop in future. They go on to say that it lacks deep and complex systems. This one I personally disagree with. I think there's quite a few there. Espionage, for example. And then finally, that it's a bit mobile. It's a bit arcadey. I can maybe see it a little bit in some of the textures on the units and graphics, but I like the world. I think it suits the bill and fits the wider strategy genre. Overall, I'm a big fan of Dune Spice Wars, and I think there is definitely some value in these criticisms, but let's not forget this is an early access release, and as I hinted at earlier, it seems like a proper one that they have already announced they'll be adding multiplayer and mods and more factions to in future. and I'll be keen to see how it develops, tentatively watching and waiting and playing as I go. I'll see you next time.